that is a most compelling passage. Sometimes Paul is obscure to the point of incomprehensibility, but this is not obscure. Suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope doesn't disappoint us. And the reason that's good news is because there's no escaping suffering. But it takes big-time spiritual work to get from suffering to hope. These words are huge, they're pregnant with meaning, and they're a little intimidating because they're rather aspirational. When I think about suffering and endurance and character, I'm mostly not real excited. I'd just as soon go straight to the hope and skip all that suffering and endurance and character building stuff, right? I have a friend who says all of her sufferings are, she uses a profanity word, and then says a profanity word, growth opportunity. And when she tells you she's in the middle of a growth opportunity, you know she's really mad at her life right now. That happens. And suffering comes from a lot of sources. And some of them, some suffering has a reason. You did something dumb. But a lot of suffering doesn't have a reason. There's no cosmic reason for childhood cancer. There's no cosmic reason for addiction. It's just how human life works. But Paul's overriding concern in this passage is not our everyday suffering, but the suffering that comes to us because we have chosen to walk the way, a path, a journey, a spiritual journey. We talk about God, and you'll often hear people say, well, everything is God's will. I don't believe that. I think there's a lot of stuff that isn't God's will. A lot of stuff humans do isn't God's will. We actually have free will. It's not a trick. It's not something God lets us have. We actually have free will, and therefore there is suffering. I don't think it's part of God's plan that you should suffer. I don't. But you will, because that is how the world is. Why is there evil? Why do bad things happen to good people? Worse, why do good things happen to bad people? That's what I want to know. Sometimes stuff just happens. Life is in session. Your suffering is not a part of God's plan for you. But God has a plan for walking with you as you go from suffering to endurance to character to hope. One of the things that marks out people on the way, that's us, people on the way, is that we learn to accept normal suffering in life. That doesn't mean we are content with injustice, but we do accept that injustice happened. Maybe you were mistreated in your job. It's not okay that that happened, but it did happen. And, as my son once said, well, Mom, people get treated badly at work. It was your turn. I think he was tired of hearing me complain. And there's a lot more to say about the nature of suffering, and I've said it in previous sermons. Today, let's ponder this thing that Paul is talking about in his passage, the suffering that comes to us when we are on the way or away. And we're going to start this morning with a little video. We are celebrating the Mandalorian. I don't think that's too awful a word to celebrate the delights of the Mandalorian. And if you don't find the Mandalorian delightful, that's fine. We're not preaching about the gospel of the Mandalorian, and you don't ever have to watch a single episode of the Mandalorian to get what we're talking about today. But we're about to see a place where the Mandalorian has returned. A planet that used to be a mess is now recovered, and Carl Weathers plays this fabulous character, and he's now the High Magistrate, and he offers the Mandalorian the perfect answer to his trouble. Let's have the video. The lights are going to come down, and then we'll see the video.
Now, as I was saying, there's a beautiful parcel available right down here by the flats.
I appreciate the offer, but I have some matters to look after.
Well, I'm confused. I thought you had completed your mission, but you're still running around here with the same little critter.
It's complicated. I completed my quest. He returned to me. I removed my helmet, and now I'm an apostate.
Which is all the more reason for you to stay here with us. Where you're from, you may be an apostate, but here, you'd be landed gentry.
I love it. Mando gets offered what is the perfect answer. He needs to hide out from the people who are looking for him. More importantly, he needs to keep this child safe from the people who are looking for them. And in the beginning of the series, we were introduced to the Mandalorian creed, the way, by the Mandalorian and some of his cohorts saying things like, "This is the way." And slowly, we began to understand that this was shorthand for people in the know, that they are making choices that are consistent with their strong moral creed. And as the first 2 seasons progressed, we learned how important that is to the Mandalorian, Din Djarin, to be faithful to his creed, to be faithful to the way. And as we learn about the creed, it has some things for us to admire and some things we may not admire. It requires faithfulness to the tribe. It requires knowing what the way is. It requires training. That's good. Faithfulness to one's word. And, interestingly, a willingness to sacrifice or endure pain for the sake of staying faithful. Suffering can come from a willingness to sacrifice or endure pain for the sake of staying faithful. So today we see Mando opting out of a comfortable retirement. It looks for all the world like one of those Dellwood retirement places in Nipomo where there's a great restaurant and a beautiful golf course and people who, I just love those. I love those. They're not priced for retired pastors, but they're pretty awesome. And it seems ideal for him, but his way is shifting. It's easy to understand why he would do that, but that is not how to embrace the fullness of the way. It's not a way that we embrace the fullness of life. Running from what is difficult never helps us embrace a greater life. Now, I am not suggesting that you go looking for trouble, or that there aren't some times when walking away from trouble isn't the answer, but endlessly struggling to eliminate all discomfort, endlessly struggling to eliminate anything disagreeable, anyone disagreeable, takes you out of your life. And it gets you focusing on the idea that you can somehow have a life in which there is no struggle and no suffering. You may be able to avoid some suffering. And we should all try to avoid unnecessary suffering. But not the suffering that is part of our fullness of life, our aliveness. My husband and I, when we, what you ask your spouse when they come home from a day at work is, how was your day? And sometimes the answer we gave was rich and full. My day was rich and full. It doesn't mean it was a good day. It just meant that my day was rich in full, which I suppose is better than uneventful, but it's also nice to go home and have someone say, "How was your day?" and to say, "Uneventful." Thank goodness, right? When we are committed to the way, we recognize it. And we have to deal with the fact that in addition to the suffering that comes to all people, there's a certain kind of suffering that produces endurance, which produces character, which gets us to hope that comes from embracing the suffering we have precisely because we are on the way. Even little tiny sufferings, like coming to church even though you lost an hour of sleep. Because being with your community of faith is important enough to you that a small sacrifice comes with it. Suffering, though, comes when we choose a path. It comes when we choose to fight for justice instead of looking away. Suffering can come when we choose generosity over acquisitiveness. Suffering can come when we show up bravely in our town for those who are defenseless. But what happens when we come to a crossroads or a challenge on our way? What happens when we seek to try to be true to ourselves, true to our personal creed, true to the Christian path insofar as we're able to discern it? We may face suffering, and then we have some choices. We have some choices. One of the choices that people often choose is to simply walk away. They abandon their faith. They come to be Christians, and they are shocked when they realize that their faith does not protect them from all unhappiness. And to be fair, some people are charmed into becoming Christians by the idea that once you have God in your life, nothing bad will ever happen to you again. All of you have chosen a path that includes God. Have any of you had exactly zero troubles? If you have had zero troubles since you put God at the center of your life, I want you to raise your hand right now. You've had absolutely no troubles. All of life has been easy and smooth for you. I don't want to miss you guys. Might have been one of you. Okay. Somebody somewhere, but not here. People who are new to the faith and have not been tested by some of the deep, protracted struggle that can come with trying to be faithful, when the going gets tough, they get going. But that same struggle, that awareness that somehow your faith doesn't protect you from a regular human life, and sometimes it increases the level of your struggle, particularly inside as you're trying to sort out your own ethical and moral core, that is precisely what can get us into trouble, and it is precisely what brings us to a life with endurance, character, and hope. I was just having a chat with one of the choir members this morning, and I said, our culture does not cultivate forbearance. Paul uses the word endurance, but I think a word that is not often used is forbearance. And forbearance comes to us when we recognize that our life is a human life, life is in session, and some things you can't do anything about. No matter how much NyQuil you take, your virus will take however long it takes to be done. And some more difficult things, much more difficult things, are the same. Most of us have had at least one season of trying too hard to make life go away. Another alternative to the progression Paul describes is anger. Anger in response to faith is not the same as losing faith, although anger can take you to a loss of faith. But even people who keep their faith in a time of struggle can be angry about it. We may be angry that our distress happens in ways that we think aren't fair, and maybe they're not. Something unfair is almost certain to happen to you today. But it's not that you have been singled out for unfairness. You're going to get your share. And some people get more than their fair share, I have to say. We may be angry that people we thought we could count on aren't there for us. We may be angry at how much work it takes to be a person of faith. We may certainly be angry at God. We can even go through all of those stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, when we are fully alive, witnessing life as it happens. If you've never felt any of this, you are in the minority. This is the stage of spiritual growth where we begin to understand what following God means and how exactly God loves and cares for us. We learn the difference between an easy life and a rich and full life. And finally, self-pity is probably the easiest trap, particularly for Americans, because so many things are so blessed and easy for us. Someone mocks us for going to church on Sunday instead of going to the champagne brunch. Or someone tells us to take our faith expression off the wall at our workplace. Or we lament the days gone by when they didn't play soccer on Sundays and everybody came to church because it was a lot more fun then. We are too quick to see these things as suffering. They may be annoyances, or maybe they're not, I don't know, but they are not suffering. Lose your job, or lose your life, or lose your mental health, or just lose your way because of your faith. That's suffering. But it's seldom that black and white, right? Most of us aren't trying to figure out suffering from losing our life because we stood up for something that's going to get us executed, the way it would be in Pakistan right now. And most of us don't whine about somebody who mocks us if we happen to pray over dinner in public. Most of the rest of it is in that gray area where we get so aggravated and we have to evaluate, is this really great suffering? And if it is, what do I do about it? We know that the pilgrimage from suffering to hope is not linear. Suffering, endurance, character, hope, they're not bus stops along a journey, and if you just get on the bus, you'll be fine. Every stage has its own challenge, and we go back and revisit those challenges every time we grow as people. And every stage has something to teach us. Every stage has its reward, even if it's not easy, and even if we can't see where God is taking us. So what might you do to bring more aliveness to your life? Where can you put your focus? Well, I think it's right there in verse 5. Hope doesn't disappoint us. We deal in hope. Hope doesn't disappoint us because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit. God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit. This generosity of God is worth holding up. In affirming God's love being poured into our hearts, we also notice that we need it poured. It doesn't grow there because we decided it should grow there. It comes to us as a gift, and we need to drink it in freely and eagerly over and over in order for our lives to continue to blossom and grow. This is God's power at work that allows us to walk this road of progression from suffering to endurance, to character, to hope. It reminds us that the Christian adventure is not a do-it-yourself adventure. We travel this road together. This is the spiritual journey. Jesus, and we have the internal spiritual journey. Our church is very focused on ministry beyond the building and how important it is to live our Christianity out loud in the street. But we have to remember that our own spiritual journey inside us is what strengthens us and guides us. That's how we learn to be on the way. Hope comes from experiencing this progression, this growth. And that's one of the things we see in The Mandalorian. Din Djarin doesn't seem to be particularly troubled by physical pain. And in the way of a space opera, there's lots of just gratuitous and indiscriminate violence. And there's a certain cool factor to that if you like all the CGI stuff, and some people think that's a lot of fun. Personally, I fast forward through that because I just don't need to see that much of it, although some of the martial arts stuff is pretty cool. But he's not troubled by that. His struggle comes with the suffering of his soul, when suddenly he's on shaky ground with his creed, the thing that was holding his life together. And now he's finding emotions he never had before, doesn't know what to do with those emotions, needs to learn how to incorporate that into his creed, and it's shifting some. This is the struggle. For him, it's not the suffering of the physical battering that comes from physical battle. So perhaps the greatest of these, as Corinthians says, isn't love. It's hope. Hope. Without hope, we cannot find God. Without hope, we cannot find God. We can't hear God. We can't speak to God. Without hope, we can't find our way. Without hope, we can't be honest or caring or hardworking. Without hope, well, is life worth living? Without hope? Hope is our heritage. Hope is our way. And I am glad you are here with me on this way. And all God's people agreed and said,